going to get ourselves started here. I'm Dan Solmacy. I'm the Kilbride Clinton Professor of Medicine and Ethics here at the Divinity School of the Department of Medicine, and the Director of the Program of Medicine and Religion, and along with the Marty Center, we're the sponsors of this program. And I want to welcome all of you to the University of Chicago, to this beautiful space that you've not been here before at the Divinity School. I want to, at the outset, thank the McDonald-Agape Foundation for their support for this program. It couldn't happen without their generous philanthropy. Alonzo McDonald apparently is unable to be with us today, but the president, Peter McDonald, is here with us, as well as Mark Maurice from the foundation. We're extraordinarily grateful to them for allowing this to happen. It is the first in a series of 4 annual conferences on dying a Christian death that we are hoping to carry out. And the intent is to bring together Christians to reflect on these topics as Christian thinkers. And it's also done to accompany a book project of mine called Now and at the Hour of Our Death, which is sponsored by another grant from the Enhancing Life program. And the reason that we want to do this as a bunch of Christian thinkers is not that other people don't have something to say or don't matter, but that sometimes the good of inclusiveness precludes, I think, the possibility of uncovering serious disagreements and some fine-grained analyses that might be very specific to a faith tradition. Speaking of inclusiveness, we don't, you will note as we go on for the day that we don't have any women on the panel. It wasn't for lack of trying. Women all turned us down. They were too busy. So. But there will be, I can assure you, at other conferences in the series. I also want to suggest at the outset that to some extent, you'll hear there's an assumption through this conference that euthanasia and assisted suicide are off the table. While there are maybe a few Christians who support physician-assisted suicide, I don't think it's a majority opinion among Christian thinkers. And the controversy about sedation really only has force, I think, if one is opposed to euthanasia and assisted suicide. If you're for them, then it seems like it's just a slow way of accomplishing that end. So if you are here and you're in favor of physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, then you want to approach the entire conference as one long 8-hour conditional argument. If one were opposed to euthanasia and assisted suicide, this is how one would think about sedation at the end of life. We have, as you can see, a great lineup of speakers. The format is going to be 50-minute sessions, where I'm hoping we'll have, depending on how brief our speakers are, time for discussion after each of their initial presentations. My co-convener, Farrow from Duke, and I will alternate in moderating the sessions. There'll be coffee breaks placed appropriately, and we'll have boxed lunches available at 12:30. And then after everyone has spoken, we'll have a plenary discussion to try to really grapple with the questions. Looking at the brochure, you can see the way we sort of set it up is we want to begin with sort of general theological questions. Then we're going to move to talking about the clinical reality. Then begin to talk about some moral principles and their application. And then finally we'll end with some pastoral reflections on these kinds of questions before we get into the plenary discussion. So we want to look at the question fairly comprehensively. Important housekeeping, bathrooms, if we haven't noted already, The men's room is on this floor, the women's down one flight. And lastly, I'm going to be pretty rigorous about trying to keep people on time. Where's Far? There you go. I want you to do the same, because we really, in order to get through this, have to be pretty rigorous about it. So with those preliminaries, let me introduce our first speaker for the day, and that's Douglas Farrow, who's a professor of Christian thought and holder of the Kennedy Smith Chair in Catholic Studies at McGill University in Montreal. He formerly taught at King's College London. His most recent books are Ascension, Theology, and Desiring a Better Country. He is a member of the Academy of Catholic Theology and the Advisory Council for the Institute on Religion and Public Life. He's a frequent contributor to First Things and other journals. He also serves on the advisory board of Nova et Vetera and is co-editor of Ashgate's Great Theologians series. Besides teaching theology and ethics at McGill, he works with the Newman Institute and the Pluralism, Religion, and Public Policy Project. He received a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for his contributions to public discourse on significant social issues, something that always makes Americans envious that we would have that people get prizes named for royalty. So please join me in welcoming Professor Farrow to speak to us about reckoning with the last enemy. Thereupon he advanced even as far as death itself.
Thank you, Daniel, and it is a real privilege for me to be here. Speaking at 8 in the morning is something about 2 hours earlier than I ever do. But that shows how grateful I am to be here, and I expect to learn a lot more about medicine than you will learn about theology in the next 35 minutes. But congratulations also for getting started only 5 minutes late. And I'll commence right away so as not to put you further behind. Dying a Christian death in the 21st century. I expect this will mean for many, as it did in the 20th century, dying a martyr's death. But already it means for more than a few, facing down a doctor or nurse or insurance agent who is nudging you towards that most unchristian of deaths, namely state-assisted suicide or euthanasia. My friend George Weigel remarked not long ago at First Things that when his summer neighbors here in Quebec, I read his remarks, were growing up, their parents sought the intercession of Brother Andre for their sick. Today, 3 members of my summer parish were each asked, on being given a diagnosis of cancer, whether they wished to be euthanized. And that was the first question put to them. Quebec is about to become this continent's premier state-sponsored killing ground of the inconveniently ill and elderly, and it seems likely that the severely disabled won't be far behind. End quote. When we keep this in view, our own questions about the moral licitness of palliative as opposed to terminal or terminating sedation seems somewhat over-scrupulous. But of course, one thing leads to another unless we are scrupulous. We ought indeed to ask ourselves about the precise role, as well as the particular measures, of pain relief, and to ask this as a moral and not merely a medical question. It is the supposition that medicine can somehow be amoral without being immoral that leads, as it has in Canada, to so-called medical aid in dying, MAID. A cleverly crafted euphemism, not for anything properly medical, but for state-assisted suicide and indeed state-sponsored killing. I've not been asked to address this directly, however, but rather to address theological issues that arise at the intersection between suffering and death and the mandate to heal, or at least to comfort in the face of suffering and death. I've even been asked to bring to bear consideration of the afterlife, or as I would prefer to say, of the human vocation to immortality. I'm very glad to do so, for without this larger frame of reference, it is not possible to do the job properly. Now, of course, dying a Christian death is one thing from the standpoint of the dying person, and another from the standpoint of the one charged with his or her care. The former will want to die Christianly, whether or not attended by Christians. The latter will want to be Christian in the caring, whether or not the dying person is a Christian. Though if he is not, or if he is an ill-informed Christian, then significant differences may arise in regard to the care, just as significant differences may arise between carers when one is thinking Christianly and the other not. So we'll have to return to that in due course, albeit briefly. What I want to do first is to make several points about what it means to think Christianly on the subject of suffering and death. First, suffering and death are neither good nor natural. I think we better begin here. This is the Christian place to begin. The world has not always been. It had a beginning, and as we know it, it will have an end. But the human creature was made for fellowship with the living God. God is man's end. It does not belong to man for man to die, but rather to live. Death is the consequence of sin and of the judgment passed upon the sinner. Only as a consequence of sin is it natural. Likewise, it does not belong to man to be unhappy, but to be happy. Happiness is what all men want, and happiness is certainly possible. Only as a consequence of sin does man become unhappy. Though as a consequence of being but a creature, he is at first only imperfectly happy. St. Anselm rightly insists in his Monologion, I quote, that the human soul is created to love the supreme essence. And so also he insists that it is not possible to think coherently about this highest of all vocations without thinking at the same time of immortality. Not just any kind of immortality, however, such as the kind our biotechnology experts have in mind in the so-called Immortality Project or in its transhumanist offshoots. For that is just perpetual life, not the good life or the happy life. Listen to Anselm, I quote, "The human soul that always strives to love the supreme life never loses its life." Well, what sort of life? Long life on its own, after all, is no great thing, nor without real immunity, not without real immunity from adversity. What is life lived in fear, suffering, or in the illusion of security, but life lived in unhappiness? The happy life is the life that is free of all of this. And will the nature that always loves the supremely good and omnipotent always live an unhappy life? Quite absurd. Clearly, therefore, this is the sort of life that belongs to the human soul, provided that it keeps to the purpose for which it exists. It will at some time live the happy life, the life truly immune from death and from all distress. End quote. If it does not keep to its purpose, however, the human soul does not simply disappear, for its vocation is irrevocable. Rather, it has an endlessly unhappy life, shut out from the presence of its Maker, as Jesus himself taught. If you grasp this starting point, that man is made to live because he is made for the living God, you already have everything you need. But this starting point is both attacked by those who reject Christianity and undermined by many who accept it. The latter will normally claim that death is natural, but that we now experience it unnaturally as a result of the fear that accompanies sin. I recommend to you, in answer to that beguiling view, a fascinating fictional work by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Athrobeth Finrod Andreth. With sincere searching, you can find that online. I couldn't, but my young son did it for me. Andreth responds to Finrod just as Anselm would have. We knew that in our beginning we had been born never to die. And by that, my Lord, we meant born to life everlasting, without any shadow in the end. End quote. It's a long and fascinating discourse about death and immortality. Highly recommend it to you. A disclaimer, however. To make good on this first point, for today's man of science, steeped in evolutionary thinking, I would have, obviously, to talk about how the Christian understanding of man's beginning can, and how it cannot, embrace that thinking. But I'll not attempt that here. My point is simply that, theologically speaking, man, qua man, was not made to die. Number two, then, follows. Death is no friend. Death is an enemy, the last enemy of man. Death is not a friend, even where it comes to him as a friend, or is earnestly desired. My father died not long ago, shortly after his 95th birthday. My sister took him to his doctor, and he told the doctor not to bother with him. He had enough of that meant. He was ready to go and fully expected to go. At that point, he regarded death as a kind of friend, because it put an end to that which he by no means desired to go on indefinitely. That which was no longer life as it was meant to be lived. A day or so later, he died at home in my sister's presence of a pneumonia the doctor, perhaps taking his instructions at face value, had missed. Death did come, in a sense, as a friend. A fortiori, it comes as a friend to the person being tortured, or devoured by disease, or perchance by grief. That is why people sometimes take their own life, or why they demand euthanasia. Once they desired that some or even all limits be removed from them, now they desire that there be a limit, a final limit. Yet I repeat, death is not a friend of man. For death is the dissolution of the unity between the soul and the body that a man is. The soul cannot wish the death of the body, of which it is, by divine design and divine gift, the life-giving form, without in some way contradicting itself. For the creature, it is good that there be limits, for the creature is that which has a beginning, and in having a beginning requires other kinds of limits, which serve it as a guide to its ends, to the fulfillment of its nature. One might turn for help here to Saint Irenaeus, who is brilliant on the subject. Moreover, it is good, given the fall, that there be limits to sin and limits to suffering, where sin has corrupted a nature and consigned it to suffering. In the mercy of God, death provides such a limit. But death remains a judgment, not a solution. It remains an enemy, even where it is a friend. Death is not salvation. Death is dissolution. Death is defeat. Death is the last enemy. 3. Suffering and even death may nevertheless be good for us. We ought to agree with Paul and to disagree, if need be, with Leon Cass, for example, who claims That to argue that human life would be better without death is to argue that human life would be better off being something other than human. End quote. Here again, I recommend Tolkien as a directive. We may agree with Dr. Cass, however, that what we are really longing for when we resent rather than welcome death is not mere continuance, but, as he says, wholeness, wisdom, goodness, and godliness. And for the pursuit of that, given the fact of our fall, suffering, even the suffering of death, can indeed be good for us when rightly undertaken. The martyrs are already sufficient proof of that, surely. They remind us that suffering itself is not the last enemy, but an instrument for defeating the last enemy. For that is what God himself in the person of Jesus Christ has made it, made of it. He who knew no sin was made sin for us. He who is subject neither to suffering nor to death bore our sorrows and suffered our death, and by his stripes we are healed. We all know that suffering can have a remedial function, both for the body, as in athletic training, say, or confinement to a cast, and for the soul, which also needs training and restraining. Suffering can and should contribute to the wholeness, wisdom, goodness, and godliness of the soul. Alas, it often doesn't. It is an urgent theological, pastoral, and medical task, particularly at the present time, to explain that avoiding or resenting suffering may prove an evil rather than a good. To explain the goodness of suffering for remedial purposes. Listen to St. John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae, quote, "The only goal which counts today is the pursuit of one's own material well-being. The so-called quality of life is interpreted primarily or exclusively as economic efficiency, inordinate consumerism, physical beauty and pleasure, to the neglect of the more profound dimensions, interpersonal, spiritual, and religious, of existence. In such a context, suffering, an inescapable burden of human existence, but also a factor of possible personal growth, is censored, rejected as useless, indeed opposed as an evil, always in every way to be avoided. When it cannot be avoided and the prospect of even some future well-being vanishes, then life appears to have lost all meaning, and the temptation grows in man to claim the right to suppress it. Within this same cultural climate, the body is no longer perceived as a properly personal reality, a sign and place of relations with others, with God, and with the world. It is reduced to pure materiality. It is simply a complex of organs, functions, and energies to be used according to the sole criteria of pleasure and efficiency." End quote. As John Paul said elsewhere in his Lithuanian homily on the Hill of Crosses, the cross of Jesus Christ has given meaning and value to suffering, to illness, and to sorrow. It's well known, of course, that his own very public suffering from Parkinson's was something he offered up with a view to teaching this lesson. Francis Cardinal George was also eloquent in this respect. Fourth, after the dissolution that is death, there is still a future for body and soul. If the cross gives meaning and value to suffering, the resurrection and bodily ascension of Jesus guarantee that there is still a future for body and soul. The resurrection of Jesus is the central fact of the Christian faith. It's sine qua non. It guarantees this future. But what future? There is a future in happiness, and as we heard earlier from Anselm, a future in unhappiness. To remind people of that is a still more urgent task. than to explain the goodness of suffering for remedial purposes. The latter cannot be done effectively without the former. The way we live in the body and the way we die in the body is the determining element as regards our future. Which means, of course, that death may or may not mean or entail the cessation of suffering. It is the cessation of suffering for those perfected in righteousness, for the saint or the martyr. Not so for the wicked, which is why men fear death. For those who have not and will not have their salvation in Christ, death is not the terminus of suffering, but the threshold of an untreatable suffering. A suffering that has no remedy and is not itself remedial. Death is not the cessation of suffering even for those who are made beneficiaries of Christ, if their justification through faith in Him is deficient in the sanctification that it requires. For no one can enter into the glory of Christ or into the bliss of His kingdom without justice of soul. No one can be happy without justice of soul. And the letting go of injustice in the soul, purgation to use the classical term, is also a kind of suffering, albeit a joyful suffering, a suffering that heals. It must be remarked here that it has always been urgent, Christianly speaking, to remind people that there is a future in happiness and a future in unhappiness. But it is especially urgent today, as assisted suicide and euthanasia become normalized. For such acts, deliberately and competently undertaken, determine us for unhappiness. Christians ask the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, to pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. We know that divine grace is still open to us at that hour, that even then, even where faith and repentance have been lacking, they may yet be possible. But if we ourselves determine the hour of our death, thereby asserting that our lives belong to us and not to God, that we are free to dispose of them as we will, though they were given to us without our will, what then? Does grace remain? Can we still pray the Hail Mary? Have we not turned at the last away from repentance and faith, and so from grace? Is it not the doors of hell on which we are pushing, rather than the gates of glory? If all that is so, and the Church has always insisted that it is so, though I know a number of bishops who are afraid to keep insisting it, it can never be just or compassionate to obscure it from people. That some people take their own lives without full moral competence, and that we may in these cases still hope and pray for their salvation, does not relieve us of the obligation to tell those who are more or less of sound mind that suicide and euthanasia is a self-determination for hell rather than heaven. Why? The medical practitioner, as neighbor to the dying, must be concerned with the good both of body and of soul. In Christian anthropology, the soul is not merely incidentally or accidentally related to the body. It is not something that exists prior to the body or that belongs to the body only temporarily. The human being is, as Augustine says on the Morals of the Catholic Church, a rational soul with a mortal and earthly body in its service. As such, it is divisible, or rather dissoluble. But the rational soul of a human being, as distinct from the rational soul of an angel, is for the body, just as the body is for the soul. Man is as much body as he is soul. Thus already Tertullian and Irenaeus before him. The perfection of the human being entails the perfection of the body too, through proper submission of body to soul, and of both to the Spirit of God, who gives to body and soul the freedom and glory proper to each. If these things are so, we must follow Augustine when he observes in De Moralitas Ecclesiae that doing good to the neighbor in fulfillment of the second great commandment can only mean doing good to both body and soul. First, do no ill. Yes, the love of neighbor works no ill. He quotes the scripture on that. Then, do good to the neighbor. Love the neighbor as you love yourself. To do good to the body is called medicine, though of course he's using that term much more broadly than we do, to refer to anything that benefits the body, guarding it, he says, against injuries and mishaps from without as well as from within. To do good to the soul is called discipline. It is discipline, he says in section 55, by which the health of the mind is restored, without which bodily health avails nothing for security against misery. End quote. This, he remarks, is a subject of great difficulty. If it weren't, we wouldn't be here today. But he says, these things require more than mere goodwill and can be done only by a high degree of thoughtfulness and prudence, which belongs only to those to whom it is given by God, the source of all good. Since it is God who gives to all things their being and their well-being, it is to God that we must look for the kind of prudence that is necessary here. If we will not look to God, we will not develop the requisite prudence, no matter how thoughtful we are. So after my talk, I will get up and give the opening prayer that he omitted. Now, with respect to the body, Augustine says, those who seasonably and wisely supply all the things required for warding off evils and distresses are called compassionate. Though if they are wise, he adds, no painful feeling disturbs their mind in the exercise of compassion. There's no harm in the word compassionate, he says, so long as there's no passion in the case. With respect to the soul, that is, to the discipline of the mind, that includes two things, restraint and instruction. Restraint implies fear on the part of the one being held, as in the saying, fear God. Instruction, even where the instruction begins with the admonition to fear God, implies love on the part of both the helper and the helped. Augustine sums up thus, and I've come a long way around to give you this as a kind of guide for the rest of your discussion. He then, who loves his neighbor, endeavors all he can to procure his safety in body and in soul, and here's the key bit, making the health of the mind the standard in his treatment of the body. And as regards the mind, his endeavors are in this order, that he should first fear and then love God. End quote. That's section 56. From this we may draw two conclusions. First, a conclusion that bears directly on the concern of our present conference. Medicine that renders discipline impossible is anthropologically disordered. Second, a conclusion that bears on those either charged with discipline or finding occasion to cultivate it. Discipline, again, in the broad sense of doing good to the mind or soul, involves warnings as well as assurances. Is the person helped to face death who is not positively encouraged to fear God, who alone gives to all things their being and their well-being, and then to love God, who has on that person's behalf himself faced death? The right way to do this, Christianly speaking, is by reference to Jesus Christ, who, as Irenaeus put it, and I share this quotation with you as something you might cut and paste another time and keep on your fridge door. Jesus Christ, he says, made himself a master for us in everything pertaining to the human condition, not despising or evading any condition of humanity, nor setting aside in himself that law which he had appointed for the human race, but sanctifying every age by that period corresponding to it which belonged to himself. For he came to save all through means of himself. All, I say, who through him are born again to God, infants and children, boys and youths and older people. He therefore passed through every age, becoming an infant for infants, thus sanctifying infants, a child for children, thus sanctifying those who are of this age, being at the same time made to them an example of piety, righteousness, and submission. A youth for youths, becoming an example to youths, and thus sanctifying them. So likewise, he was an old man for old men, that he might be a perfect master for all, not merely as respects the setting forth of the truth, but also as regards age, sanctifying at the same time the aged also, and becoming an example to them likewise. Then at last, he advanced even as far as death itself. The image is almost military here. That he might be the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. The Prince of Life, existing before all and going before all. End quote. Those caregivers who themselves have faith in this master, when accompanying as far as possible those who are themselves advancing in his train to meet the last enemy, will ask themselves whether the good they are still seeking to do to the body, even at this late hour, is also a good being done to the soul, or is at least open to that good, that much higher good. Now, I have about 5 minutes, so I'll just hastily read you the last 2 pages. 6. This requires careful circumscription of the patient autonomy principle on the one hand, and of the utility principle on the other. I do not mean to suggest that the patient who has too little fear or love to receive this discipline, the discipline of the good news of the Master's accompaniment, that it should be forced upon him. How could it be? In such a case, one must be content to consider what discipline the patient might himself wish to receive or to exercise. But these days, the patient autonomy principle in some jurisdictions, including my own up in Canada, is being interpreted as including the right to assisted suicide or to euthanasia. And this, of course, calls for self-discipline on the part of the carer. Cooperation in assisted suicide, never mind euthanasia, is an act closed to the good of the soul. It is unacceptable to either the God-fearing patient or the God-fearing caregiver. Mercy killing, so-called, is not merciful. It may be compassionate, but as Augustine would say, there's a false and undisciplined compassion in the case, It makes the enormous mistake of treating suffering rather than death as the last enemy. It may even send a person to meet death in a state of mortal sin. Here the carer must, if she means to be Christian and to look to the good of her own immortal soul, refuse the demands of the state, of co-workers, and of the patient himself, whatever the consequences. Neither is the utilitarian ethic of some governments, medical boards, hospitals, and even families are next of kin, an ethic to which the God-fearing caregiver can subscribe or conform. That ethic, which is generally an exercise in cost-benefit analysis of one kind or another, may in an all too dispassionate manner require the termination of medical treatment with hardly a thought about what is good for the body, and no thought at all about what is good for the soul. The aim of medicine, whether the body is or is not past all natural healing, must be to support discipline, no more and no less. Our answer to the question about palliative sedation must meet this standard. Augustine's standard. The Christian medical community must labor to convince the non-Christian sector that taking life, and even under certain circumstances, depriving a living person of their consciousness and remaining capacity for discipline, especially their capacity to hear the fear not of the gospel of Jesus, is wrong. Finally then, 7. Medicine as a natural good worked by general graces is impossible to sustain without the supernatural good to which it is subordinate. I want you to hear that point. Some are sure to say in response to everything that I already said, it may be well and good for Christians should they find themselves living and working in a Christian jurisdiction under basically Christian rules. Otherwise, it's utopian and not at all realistic. Not only because it begs many practical questions, which it does, but because medicine is no longer organized or practiced in such a way as to leave room for this explicitly Christian approach to death and dying. Secular hospitals and professional associations and ethics boards positively frown on specifically Christian or religious principles, for that matter, and often forbid the choices or procedures that rest upon them. Having spent a good part of my own career chronicling the ill effects of militant secularism, I appreciate the force of this criticism. But I reply, medicine itself is at stake here, along with actual human souls and destinies. Medicine is a natural good. Properly practiced, it is open supernatural good, worked by the special graces of the great physician himself. But in itself, it is a natural good, accomplished by general graces. What happens to it if it is deliberately closed off from supernatural good? I'll tell you what happens. It becomes mere technology, pure instrumentality. In the end, it becomes as open to mutilation and even to killing as to healing. We are witnessing this in our time. We witnessed Johns Hopkins caving in the other day on the mutilation. Palliative care which has always refused to have anything to do with euthanasia, has begun altering, in the face of the new legislation, its policy. We are witnessing the destruction of medicine as medicine, just as we are witnessing the destruction of democracy and human rights and freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, by the insistence that medicine and government can be God-free zones, as if there were or could be such a thing. I don't profess to know exactly how to recover medicine or the sense of medicine as a natural good subordinate to supernatural goods. Many more conferences like the present one would help, but of course what we're really talking about is the recovery of an entire culture. Meanwhile, there will have to be brave acts of dissent from the culture in which we currently find ourselves. In my own country, I would call for the establishment of more Christian hospitals and for civil disobedience in the matter of abortion and euthanasia. I am well aware that there are costs, enormous costs involved, and that acting on Christian convictions may very well make one a martyr in the sense that one is then deprived of gainful employment and fruitful medical service. In an age of martyrdom, or indeed in any age, that ought not to be decisive. One must take the long view. Blessed are you, says Jesus, when men revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Thank you.
A few moments for questions, comments, interventions. Ms. Rinneck.
Thank you very much, Justice, for your talk. It evoked in me a memory of Edith Stein's critique of Heidegger on death. And Stein confronted the meaninglessness of death that Heidegger described with the concept of fullness. So I just share that thought as maybe a clue that we can use to dialogue on this issue.
Sorry, say again. Describe the meaning of death as
Fullness.
Fullness.
F-U-L-L.
Yeah.
So Stein described death, some of the deaths that she witnessed, as victories, as if someone had run the race and won. So she was convinced that there was more to death than nothingness. And I think a lot of our discussion hinges on that difference. It goes back to the dialogue between Stein's thought and Heidegger's thought.
Yes, I think that could be helpful, and I agree that in our situation, most of the arguments that are undertaken on the principle that death is an absolute end. Obviously, that's not something to which Christian thinking can in any way subscribe. So that makes a big difference in the way we face death and see death as itself an act of faithfulness that can lead to fullness.
I would like to just get some clarification from some of the terminology that you used.
Okay.
You began with happiness, and it's my understanding that eudaimonia is more of a fullness, and then you all the way through did the body and soul, dialogue, and for me that was just really jarring because I think scientifically, how do we separate that? I mean, it just doesn't. I think of that I am not I, and I think of like in Gaudium and Spes where we have the whole dialogue in terms of understanding personal ethical decision making, that we have to have this sense of wholeness. And Louis Johnson's comes with 8 different criteria, or if you want to look at Richard Gould, he's got 4 understandings that it takes all of this to be our human person, and that it seems to me that it's that fullness of understanding that we move toward to, as a Christian, to eternal life at the point of our death. So I found it really challenging to try to follow. I think I get what you're saying ultimately, but your terminology, just I have to say, really threw me. So whatever you might be able to say to explain more exactly why you choose those particular. It sounds like dualism to me.
Well, I thought I took some trouble to distinguish it from dualism, offering a combination of early patristic thinking on the subject and medieval thinking from Aquinas, neither of which are remotely dualist. That the human being is both body and soul is a staple of the whole Christian. But that the soul is something independent of the body rather than itself the form of the human person, qua embodied creature, is a misunderstanding of the Christian tradition. That's dualism, and that's not the Christian tradition. I heard the other day in a sermon the priest say, you are essentially a soul experiencing for a time a body. Well, that's just heresy in Christian terms. That's dualism, and I'm absolutely against it. But you cannot speak of the wholeness or fullness or happiness of the human being without taking account of this distinction between the goods of the body and the goods of the mind or other aspects of the soul. You can't do it, and the Christian tradition has never tried to do it. I mean, there may be a few people today who are within the Christian tradition who are trying to do it, but they're making a fundamental mistake. So the opposite of dualism is not, it may be monism, but neither of those are what Christianity talks about. You're not talking just about a body with it that happens to have a more intelligent brain. But neither are you talking about a soul which happens to be in a body.
I wonder about
Well, that's all I was doing.
Okay. If that's where you're going,
There'll be more opportunities for dialogue in the plenary if you want to keep that thought there. We have time for one more question. Back.
So the question, the statement under point 4, no one can be happy without justice in the soul.
Yeah.
Kind of goes back as far as Plato's Gorgias, where the double helix compares justice in the soul to medicine for the body.
Yeah.
And they're both connected to justice, but sort of the question for me is once you raise the question of justice, don't you also have to talk about society? And perhaps also the church as a particular kind of society.
Yes, indeed. Would you like to take the next 2 seconds?
Give us the Cliff Notes response to it.
Well, I mean, when we are talking about the relationship between the carer and the person being cared for, we are already in the social sphere. And when we're talking about that in terms of the shaping of that care and that relationship by Christian principles, we're in the ecclesiastical sphere. And when we're talking about the freedom to do that against the dicta of courts and parliaments and professional associations, we are talking about the political sphere. And ultimately, we are talking about the reconversion of a culture that has lost its understanding of what a human being is and what a human being is for, and therefore hasn't the faintest notion what is right and wrong or good or evil in the treating of people at the end of life. That's good.
Good. Okay, I think one.
So I didn't hear if you have any thoughts about all those suffering whose cognitive functions have dissolved enough that they're no longer able to reflect on the relationship with God.
Yeah, so the principle of Augustine that I reminded us of, which I think may be useful the rest of the day, is that the care of the body has to be, it's never a question of caring only for the body or only for the soul, but the care of the body has to be determined by the needs of the soul. Obviously, when a person is past any cognitive function and past any useful consciousness, the treatment of the body itself and the physical suffering existing in the body is not having to meet the same standard because you're not trying to make the body a servant still of the soul or of the mind.
So at that point, you would say just keep the patient comfortable or uncomfortable?
Well, that's for the next people. I'm just a theologian.
Please join me in